December 1944. The iron wheels screeched as the train ground to a halt in the biting cold of an American winter. Frost clung to the windows, and inside the crowded cars dozens of German women huddled in silence. They had been told this day would come, though never in words they could trust. Propaganda had painted their enemy in the darkest shades, merciless, barbaric, eager to humiliate. Capture, they were warned, was a fate worse than death. Now, as the doors creaked open, the warnings swarmed in their minds like hornets. One woman of 24 pressed her coat tighter around her, her cheekbones sharp from hunger and sleepless nights. She had been a signals auxiliary in Leipzig, trained to fear nothing but captivity. The wind cut into her lungs as she stepped down onto the platform. The scene was both familiar and strange: barbed wire watchtowers, wooden barracks, but no snarling dogs, no shouted insults. American guards stood at attention with a detached, calm rifles slung like tools rather than threats. The silence was almost worse than the dread. And then came the smell. It drifted on the wind, rich and unmistakable. Coffee. Not the bitter ersatz of roasted barley or acorns she had known for years, but real coffee, dark and sharp, curling through the cold like smoke from another world. Her stomach tightened, her chest ached with disbelief. To smell such abundance here at the threshold of captivity felt like mockery. Yet the scent refused to vanish. It lingered, daring them to question everything they thought they knew. The women exchanged glances, fear, suspicion, hunger, and braced themselves. Whatever awaited them beyond the gate, it began with coffee. The journey to captivity had already blurred into a haze of exhaustion. It had begun weeks earlier when columns of women were gathered near Aachen as the Allies pressed deeper into the Reich. Their uniforms, once pressed and proper, were now creased, their boots' cracked hair tied in hurried knots. They were auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, telephone operators, soldiers without weapons in an army collapsing under fire. When the trucks arrived, they knew there would be no return. The road led west. The first stage was a march to a temporary holding camp. They trudged past ruined villages where chimneys stood like blackened teeth past civilians with hollow eyes who scarcely looked up as the prisoners passed. Each night the women were crowded into barns or cellars, the air thick with the smell of sweat and straw. Rumors spread in whispers they would be shipped to mines or to factories, or perhaps left to starve. At every checkpoint the American soldiers said little. Their faces betrayed neither hatred nor compassion, only a steady discipline that unsettled the women more than open cruelty would have. From there came the train, a rattling convoy of cars with barred windows. They sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, knees pressed tight, hands clutched around meagre bundles of belongings. Through the slats, the countryside rolled past fields, stripped by winter bridges, bent into the rivers, the scars of war everywhere. The women tried to sleep, but the screech of iron and the lurching stops jolted them awake. Hunger gnawed at them. The last meal in Germany had been thin soup stretched with turnips and black bread so stale it crumbled like dust. Some chewed it slowly, making it last. Others gulped it down in one desperate swallow, knowing there would be nothing more. Then came the sea crossing. The ship smelled of rust, fuel and salt. The women were herded below deck, where hammocks swayed in the dark and seasickness quickly spread. Guards stood watch, but even then there was no shouting, no striking. When trays of food appeared, they stared in disbelief. Meat, potatoes, bread. They whispered that perhaps it was poisoned, or perhaps it was a final meal before slavery, and yet hunger overcame suspicion. They ate, and no punishment followed. After weeks of this limbo land came into view, the shores of America sprawling and foreign, far from the ruins of their homeland. The women pressed their faces to the small portholes, straining for a glimpse of the land of their enemies. They saw docks, cranes and warehouses, but also cars moving in neat lines, children in coats walking with mothers, smoke rising, not from bombed ruins but from busy factories. It was a world untouched by war. The sight hollowed them. Another train carried them inland deeper into the American heartland. Snow lay thick on the fields, glittering beneath a pale Sunday rose of cornstalks, dry and skeletal, lined the horizon. The train clattered across bridges and through small towns where civilians barely looked up. Some of the women whispered that perhaps they would be executed here far from witnesses. Others muttered that the Americans would sell them as slaves. No one knew. At last, the train shuddered to a halt. The guards opened the doors, gesturing with clipped commands. The women stepped down their boots, crunching on packed snow. Before them stretched the camp, wooden barracks in straight rows, fences taut, and geometric guard towers at the corners. But it was not chaos. There were no snarling dogs, no jeering crowds. The American guards stood with a calm detachment, their rifles angled down their uniforms neat. The silence itself was unbearable. The intake process began. Names were written down, numbers assigned. Belongings were searched, not ripped away, but carefully catalogued. One woman clutched a photograph of her brother, refusing to release it until the guard quietly nodded and allowed her to keep it. They were led to a wash house where steaming buckets waited. Soap was distributed, real soap, and towels that smelled faintly of starch. The women washed quickly, scrubbing away weeks of grime, confused by the simple dignity of the act. Then came the barracks. Inside, rows of bunks with straw mattresses lined the walls. Wool blankets, coarse but clean, were folded neatly at the foot of each bed. Windows let in pale light, and stoves glowed faintly in the corners. It was not luxury, but compared to the burned-out cellars of Cologne or the air-raid shelters of Leipzig, it was order. One woman whispered that it reminded her of boarding school, another muttered that it had to be a trick. And then, as they were marched toward the mess hall, the moment came. The air grew warm as they approached, and the sound of metal trays clattering echoed from inside. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying with it the scent of bread and boiled potatoes. But threaded through it all was another smell, sharp and rich, a smell so alien it seemed like mockery coffee, not the thin, bitter ersatz made from barley or acorns, not the faint, watery brew that barely deserved the name. This was real coffee, strong roasted full. The scent curled into their nostrils, awakening memories they had tried to bury. Breakfasts before rationing mornings when fathers still came home with pay, and mothers poured steaming cups into porcelain mugs. For years they had lived without it. Now, at the very threshold of captivity, it returned like a ghost. Inside the mess hall, the shock only deepened. Long tables were laid out with trays and cups. Soldiers in aprons moved briskly behind counters, ladling potatoes, slicing bread, and pouring coffee from enormous percolators that hissed and bubbled. The sound was almost musical. The women shuffled forward, eyes darting, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But none came. When her turn arrived, the 24-year-old woman stepped hesitantly to the counter. An American cook's sleeves rolled to his elbows, glanced at her only briefly before filling her cup. The dark liquid sloshed steaming, almost overflowing. She held it in both hands, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. Her throat tightened. She had not smelled or tasted real coffee in years. She lifted it slowly, almost afraid. Her lips touched the rim, and the taste hit her tongue. Bitter, strong, alive. It was overwhelming. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and unbidden. She swallowed quickly, heart racing. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some sipped cautiously, others drank greedily, their suspicion crumbling with each swallow. One muttered in disbelief, "It cannot be real." Another whispered, "Why would they waste this on us?" Then came the moment that shattered them further. When her cup was half empty, the cook gestured with a shrug. "Refill?" he asked in broken German. She froze. Surely she had misheard, but he tilted the pot, waiting. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her cup. The stream flowed again, filling it to the brim. Unlimited coffee. The idea was so absurd it felt dangerous. The women exchanged glances, shock, confusion, yearning. They had braced themselves for hunger, for brutality, for humiliation. Instead, they were handed warmth, sustenance, even comfort. It was not mercy as they understood it. It was something more subversive, more dangerous. It was the suggestion that their enemy was not the monster they had been told, but human, capable of kindness. That night, lying on her bunk, the woman stared at the ceiling, the taste of coffee lingering on her tongue. She wanted to resist, to deny it, to cling to the certainty of hatred. But her body betrayed her. The warmth in her belly, the clarity in her mind, the memory of her mother pouring coffee at the kitchen table, it was all too real. She did not know if she could trust the Americans, if this was strategy or accident, but she knew one thing. The war she had entered now was no longer fought with guns or borders. It was fought with coffee. Morning in the camp began with the clang of a metal bell, its sound rolling through the frozen air like an unwelcome alarm. The German women stirred beneath woolen blankets, reluctant to leave the fleeting warmth of their bunks. The barracks creaked as boots hit the wooden floorboards and voices whispered in the grey light. They lined up for roll call, breath rising in pale clouds, guards ticking names on clipboards with mechanical precision. The ritual was brisk, almost bored, and when it ended, the women shuffled back toward the mess hall, where the smell of bread and coffee pulled at them like a rope. Inside the mess hall was a revelation that repeated itself each day. Large steel percolators bubbled and hissed on the counter, their lids rattling faintly. The cooks moved with practiced rhythm, ladling oatmeal into bowls, slicing loaves of white bread, sliding trays of scrambled eggs or potatoes across the counter. But always there was coffee. Its aroma hung heavy in the air, dark and rich, seeping into the wooden beams and the women's very skin. At first, they treated it with suspicion. Some sipped cautiously, waiting for a catch, expecting punishment to follow. But the refills never stopped. The cooks poured cup after cup with a casual generosity that unsettled the prisoners more than cruelty would have. For women who had spent years on ersatz substitutes, roasted barley, acorns, chicory, the real thing felt like luxury stolen from memory. Each sip pulled them back to a Germany before the war, to kitchens, where their mothers filled porcelain mugs, and the mornings smelled of roast and warmth, not of fear. Yet this comfort was not simple. It came wrapped in guilt. Outside the fences, their families were hungry, living on watery turnip soup, scavenging crusts of bread from bombed ruins. Letters, when they arrived, carried desperate news: Cologne flattened, Hamburg starving, Leipzig burned. Brothers on the Eastern Front slept in frozen trenches, mothers queued for rations that never came. And here in captivity, the women had bread, meat, sugar, and coffee without limit. To enjoy it felt like betrayal. Many wrote in their diaries with trembling hands, "Why do they give us what our own leaders could not?" Life in the camp moved with a strange, steady rhythm. Guards patrolled the fences but rarely barked orders. Inspections were orderly affairs. Bunks checked, blankets folded, lockers opened. Work details were assigned: laundry, kitchen duty, gardening when spring came. The tasks were menial but never brutal. Some women grumbled, clinging to bitterness, muttering that the Americans were fattening them for some darker fate. Others surrendered to the routine, grateful for the structure after years of chaos. The barracks themselves were austere but orderly. Rows of wooden bunks lined the walls, straw mattresses replaced when they grew too thin, lockers for personal items locked with small latches. A stove in the center offered heat that often sputtered but rarely failed entirely. The smell of soap lingered from the wash stations, though the water was icy and the faucets clanged. Compared to the filth and fear they had braced for, it felt almost civilized. Still, suspicion lingered. At night, whispers circled the bunks. Perhaps the Americans wanted to break them with kindness. Perhaps they were being softened for propaganda photographs. Perhaps the coffee was a trick, some chemical that dulled resistance. Each theory made sense in the half-dark, but each morning the routine resumed and nothing sinister appeared. Only more coffee. For the 24-year-old auxiliary from Leipzig, the struggle was personal. She had been raised on stories of America as a land of decadence and violence, its people monstrous, incapable of mercy. Yet each day when the cook gestured with his pot and filled her cup, she felt her certainty eroding. She tried to sip slowly, to stretch each refill, but her body betrayed her. The warmth slid into her veins, her heart steadied, her mind cleared. Sometimes she caught herself savoring it, eyes closed, and shame burned hotter than the drink. The contrast with home gnawed at her. In one letter, her aunt wrote that they boiled nettles for soup. Another cousin had been killed in a raid. Her brother, still at the front, slept on frozen ground with no blanket. And here she sat in a mess hall, her belly full, the taste of coffee on her tongue. She clenched her fists, whispering, "How can this be right?" The camp itself became a small world within wires. Prisoners were encouraged to attend classes, English lessons chalked on blackboards, lectures on farming or mechanics. Some women scoffed, calling it indoctrination, but curiosity pulled others in. Books appeared from the camp library, donated by local townsfolk. Hymns drifted across the fences when church choirs visited. The sound was gentle, almost tender, and it unsettled the prisoners more than jeers would have. Work assignments sometimes placed them in the kitchens. There they saw the enormous sacks of beans, the tins of powdered milk, the steady stream of sugar and flour. Most striking of all were the barrels of coffee beans, dark and fragrant, poured by the scoopful into the machines. It seemed impossible. Back in Germany, the last bags of real coffee had vanished years ago, reserved for officers or hoarded by black markets. And yet here in enemy hands the supply seemed endless. It was not paradise. The camp was fenced, patrolled, bound by rules. Freedom was gone, and the women never forgot it. Guards still carried rifles, and the barbed wire glittered like cruel lace in the Sunday. Punishments existed, extra duties, solitary confinement, but they were rare. More than cruelty, it was monotony that defined their days. Yet within that monotony, coffee became a kind of anchor, a ritual that steadied them. The paradox grew sharper with each week. They had braced for chains and whips, for hunger and humiliation. Instead, they found order, routine, and a drink that carried them back to a lost world. The camp did not erase their fear or grief, but it confused their hatred. Each refill of coffee pressed the question deeper. If this was the enemy, why did it feel so human? The Leipzig woman began to write in her diary again, her words cramped and hurried to escape the eyes of censors. Each morning the bell rings. Each morning I drink. My brother is freezing. My mother starves. And I drink. She underlined the last words twice, the ink smudging with a tear that fell unchecked. In time, the daily rituals dulled the sharpest edges of fear. Coffee breaks became moments of conversation, women comparing stories of home trading letters when they came, sometimes even laughing softly. The mess hall, once a place of dread, became almost familiar. The clang of spoons, the hiss of percolators, the scrape of chairs, sounds of captivity, yet also sounds of survival. And always the same contradiction lingered. Within the fences, warmth, bread, and coffee without end. Beyond them, hunger, ruin, and war. The women could not reconcile the two worlds. But each day, as the steam rose from their cups, they tasted the impossible, that mercy could exist even in war. The moment of climax in captivity did not arrive with violence or punishment, but with something deceptively simple: coffee. Day after day, its presence grew from a curiosity into a ritual, and then into a symbol far larger than the tin cups it filled. For the German women behind the wire, the steady stream of dark liquid became both comfort and torment. It awakened memories, stirred guilt, and forced them to question what they had once believed unshakable. The mess hall was always alive, with noise, the shuffle of boots on wooden planks, the clang of trays, the hiss of steam from boiling pots. But it was the sound of the percolators that dominated. They bubbled like small volcanoes, filling the air with the unmistakable aroma of roasted beans. It clung to the rafters, seeped into clothing, and carried across the yard. Guards joked that you could follow the smell to find the camp, even if you were blindfolded. For the women, the scent struck chords of memory they had tried to silence. Before the war, coffee had been ordinary, almost invisible in its abundance. Fathers drank it at the breakfast table while scanning newspapers. Mothers poured it into porcelain cups beside plates of rolls and butter. Students sipped it late into the night while studying for exams. But when the war deepened and rationing hollowed, the German home front real coffee disappeared. Ersatz substitutes, burnt barley, chicory, roasted acorns, replaced it, bitter reminders of scarcity. By 1944, to taste genuine coffee was almost impossible for anyone outside the highest ranks. Now in the hands of the enemy, it flowed without end. Each refill was a paradox proof of American wealth, but also a disarming gesture of humanity. The women found themselves locked in inner battles each time the cook tilted the pot. Was accepting a refill a betrayal of those starving at home? Was drinking another cup a sign of weakness or simply survival? One morning, a chaplain entered the mess hall with a group of church volunteers. They carried hymn books and spoke little German, but their presence added another layer to the ritual. After grace was spoken, the chaplain raised his cup. To dignity, he said simply, and the women froze. The word lingered in the air. Dignity offered by the enemy, carried in a cup of coffee. The Leipzig auxiliary could not resist writing about it later that day. It is more than a drink. It is a weapon, though not of steel. They give us what we have been taught to believe. They do not possess kindness. I do not know how to guard against this. She tucked the diary under her mattress, terrified that such thoughts might mark her as disloyal even among her own comrades. Some women fought back in their own ways. One declared she would never drink, that she would not allow herself to be softened by enemy mercy. She sat stiffly at the table, refusing her cup. But the smell filled her lungs regardless, and by the third morning her resolve cracked. She lifted the cup, drank quickly, and afterward muttered excuses. Others laughed at her, but it was not cruel laughter. It was nervous, fragile, almost grateful for the release. The camp cooks seemed oblivious to the storm they stirred. For them, pouring coffee was routine, a job like any other. "Top up?" they asked, barely glancing up. To the prisoners, the question was seismic. A refill was not merely liquid. It was a challenge to their beliefs, a demand that they reconsider the very nature of the enemy. Each refill was a crack in the wall of propaganda, a drip of truth seeping into their defenses. Arguments erupted in the barracks at night. Some insisted the Americans were using abundance as propaganda, that the generosity was calculated. Others countered that the consistency of it, the casualness, spoke of something deeper. "They treat us better than our own government treats our soldiers," one woman whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of bunks. No one dared agree aloud, but many felt the truth of it. The symbolism grew impossible to ignore. Coffee became a marker of time. Morning roll, call the first cup. Midday break, another. Evening, sometimes a final small refill before lights out. It punctuated their days, dividing captivity into manageable portions. It was the rhythm of survival. And with each rhythm came memory kitchens of childhood laughter, of family now scattered, or dead streets of cities before the bombs. Coffee was not just drink, it was the ghost of normal life. One afternoon during kitchen duty, the Leipzig woman stood near the sacks of beans. She ran her fingers across them, inhaling the sharp, earthy scent. It transported her instantly, her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of a grinder, the warmth of a stove. Tears pricked her eyes before she realized what was happening. She quickly turned away, ashamed of her weakness. Yet she could not shake the thought the Americans, her sworn enemy, had given her back a fragment of home. The paradox gnawed deeper. Every sip reminded them of those starving in Germany. One woman wrote in a letter that never passed censorship, "My brother sleeps in mud, my mother boils weeds, and I drink cup after cup of coffee until my hands shake. It is unbearable." The guilt was corrosive, but so was the comfort. They could not abandon either. The climax came not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. Refill after refill, cup after cup, the walls of ideology thinned. Hatred was easier when the enemy starved you. It faltered when he poured you another drink without hesitation. The women began to see the guards not as monsters but as men, young, tired, often joking among themselves. One even slipped an extra packet of sugar into a prisoner's hand, winking as if it were nothing. That gesture burned hotter than any cruelty could. By spring, the routine was complete. The women planted small gardens inside the wire, tending beans and lettuce. They studied English words written on scraps of paper, sipping coffee as they repeated phrases aloud. The mess hall echoed with unfamiliar sounds, German accents wrapping around American words, laughter breaking the silence. Coffee was always present, steady, as the guard towers, reliable as the rising Sunday, and always the same questions haunted them. If the enemy could show mercy, what else had been a lie? If coffee could taste like home in captivity, what did home itself now mean? The women had expected to be broken by hunger and chains. Instead, they were undone by something far subtler, the mercy of endless coffee. In the end, coffee was not simply nourishment. It was a mirror reflecting back all the contradictions of war, abundance against scarcity, kindness against cruelty, humanity against propaganda. It forced them to look at themselves, at their leaders, at their enemy, and to ask questions that no one had prepared them to answer. For the Leipzig auxiliary, the turning point was clear. One morning, as the cook tilted the pot, she did not hesitate. She lifted her cup high, steady, and accepted the refill without fear. In that moment, she knew something had shifted within her. The war was still raging, her homeland, still in ruins, but a piece of her old certainty was gone. She no longer believed every word she had been told, all because of coffee. Ideology does not collapse in an instant. It erodes bit by bit like frost melting beneath a relentless Sunday. For the German women in the American prisoner of war camps, the erosion came not with blows or punishments, but with a steady stream of order, food, and above all, ideas. If coffee had been the first crack in their armor, the lessons, the books, and the films would widen that crack into a fracture too deep to ignore. At first, they resisted. Evenings in the classroom huts felt absurd. They had expected cells or mines, not benches and chalkboards. An American sergeant, young and unassuming, scrawled words across the board in thick white strokes. "Good morning. My name Ireland." His accent was clumsy, his patience surprising. The women exchanged skeptical glances, their lips pressed thin with defiance. But slowly curiosity tugged at them. They repeated the words awkwardly at first, laughter bubbling up when their tongues tripped over strange sounds. Some muttered the phrases under their breath, careful not to let the guards hear their amusement. Language was more than vocabulary. Each phrase carried with it a challenge to everything they had been told. Propaganda had declared Americans brutes incapable of culture, driven only by greed. Yet here was a sergeant who corrected their pronunciation with the same calm he might use with schoolchildren. Each repetition of "How are you?" chipped away at the certainty that the enemy was a monster. Books appeared next. Boxes of them unloaded into the camp library, novels, histories, dictionaries, even poetry. To women who had watched books burn in German squares only a few years earlier, the sight was surreal. One prisoner, barely 20, ran her fingers along the spines, as though touching something forbidden. She checked out a battered copy of Huckleberry Finn and read it in secret by the dim glow of a lamp. She did not understand every word, but the rhythm carried her to places she had never imagined. Rivers, rafts, freedom. "It feels dangerous," she whispered to her bunkmate, clutching the book like contraband. Dangerous because it opened a door in her mind that propaganda had sealed shut. The films struck harder. One afternoon the women were herded into the mess hall, where a projector rattled to life. Grainy black and white images filled the screen, skeletal figures, stumbling through the gates of liberated camps, piles of shoes, children with eyes too large for their faces. The women stared, breath caught in their throats. Some whispered denials exaggerated, lies. But the camera did not flinch. The images lingered, undeniable. For the Leipzig auxiliary, it was like a stone dropped into her chest. She had wanted to believe the rumors were false, but here was proof too stark to ignore. The silence after the film was heavier than any sermon. No guard lectured them. No officer shouted. They were simply dismissed back to their barracks, left alone with the pictures seared into their minds. For many, the real war began that night, not with rifles but with thoughts tearing at the walls of belief. Music crept in as well. From the officers' quarters, jazz floated across the yard, playful, careless, utterly alien, to a nation raised on marches and solemn anthems. At first, the women scoffed, covering their ears. But soon some found themselves humming along their feet, tapping beneath the tables. It was embarrassing, even shameful, to feel joy in the music of the enemy. Yet the notes lodged in their memories, stubborn as the scent of coffee. The contradictions piled up. They wrote letters home, careful to hide the truth. To say, "We eat well, we drink coffee every day, we read books," would have sounded like betrayal to families starving in ruins. So they wrote cautiously, "We are alive, we are safe." The unsaid words burned in their throats. The guilt became unbearable. One woman confessed to her diary, "Each time I lift my cup, I think of my brother freezing on the Eastern Front. Each page I read, I think of my mother without candles to light the dark. And yet I cannot stop. I drink, I read, I live. Does this make me faithless?" Her handwriting shook, as though she feared the words themselves were treason. Tension brewed among the prisoners. Some hardened their resolve, refusing lessons, scoffing at books, claiming that every kindness was only camouflage. Others yielded quietly, allowing themselves to be curious, even grateful. The barracks buzzed with whispered debates long after lights out. "If they are capable of mercy," one woman said, "then what else have we been lied to about?" The question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. The Americans did not push, at least not openly. They simply continued lessons each week, new books in the library, occasional concerts, newspapers written by prisoners under supervision. The camp paper carried essays on democracy, philosophy, even poetry. To read it was both thrilling and terrifying. To think, to question had become acts of rebellion this time, not against captors, but against their past selves. The Leipzig woman found herself caught between guilt and hunger for knowledge. She copied English phrases into a notebook, whispering them at night. She dreamed in fragments of 2 languages, her mind unmoored. She told herself she was only surviving, nothing more. But deep inside she knew she was changing. The collapse of ideology is not loud. It is quiet, relentless, impossible to reverse once it begins. By spring of 1945, the women no longer flinched at the sight of guards. They laughed during language drills, they borrowed books freely, they even teased one another over mispronounced words. Hatred had dulled into something else: curiosity, confusion, perhaps even reluctant respect. And with each new crack, the old lies grew harder to defend. The monster had become a man who poured coffee without hesitation. The barbarian had become a teacher with chalk dust on his fingers. The merciless enemy had become a volunteer who handed them apple pie with trembling kindness. If this was a lie, the Leipzig woman wrote one evening, then what else has been a lie? The words chilled her as she set down the pencil. For the first time she understood that the greatest battle she faced was not against barbed wire or armed guards. It was against the beliefs that had shaped her entire life. And slowly, painfully, those beliefs were collapsing. Release was supposed to mean freedom. Yet for many of the German women, walking out of the American POW camps was the beginning of a new kind of captivity, one bound not by barbed wire, but by hunger, ruin, and suspicion. The gates opened in the late spring and summer of 1945 after the Reich's surrender. Papers were signed, bundles packed, farewells murmured in halting English. The women carried their meager possessions, blankets, notebooks, sometimes even books given by guards. Some carried weight they had not borne in years, bodies filled out by regular meals, cheeks no longer hollow. But what awaited them outside the wire was a world that had withered. The train rattled across scarred landscapes. From the windows they saw villages, flattened chimneys rising like broken teeth, bridges twisted over rivers. The silence of ruin stretched farther than the eye could see. One woman pressed her face to the glass, whispering, "The Americans treated us better than our own cities ever will." No one corrected her. The truth was too heavy. When the train stopped, chaos greeted them. Crowds surged, gaunt men, hollow-eyed women, children with bellies swollen from malnutrition. The smell was not of coffee or bread, but of ash, damp wood, and despair. For the Leipzig auxiliary, the shock was almost unbearable. She longed for the regimented lines of the camp, the certainty of meals, the steady clang of the morning bell. Freedom, she discovered, did not taste sweet. It tasted of absence. She walked the ruins of her hometown in disbelief. Where once had stood neat rows of apartments, now lay rubble. A neighbor, grey-haired and limping, told her the words like artillery fire. Her father had died at Stalingrad, her mother in an air raid, her brother never returned. She stood frozen, clutching the notebook she had brought from the camp. The taste of coffee returned cruelly to her throat. To have been nourished while her bloodline starved, was that survival or betrayal? Even among relatives she found no comfort. She lodged with cousins who eyed her with suspicion. They had endured bombing, hunger, and cold. She had been a prisoner, yet she had eaten. Her cheeks held colour, her frame was stronger than theirs. One night an uncle asked sharply, "What did you give the Americans in return?" She had no answer. To say nothing would sound like a lie. To explain that mercy had come without barter would only deepen their mistrust. On the streets, whispers followed returnees. Some neighbors claimed the Americans had brainwashed them. Others sneered that they had grown fat in captivity. Children stared at them with a mix of envy and resentment. The Leipzig woman avoided their gaze, for every glance felt like an accusation. At night she lay awake on straw bedding, remembering the barracks bunks she had once cursed. The camp had offered a paradoxical safety, predictable meals, guards, who followed rules, even books and lessons. Now in freedom, there was nothing predictable but hunger. She remembered the chalkboard word freedom and almost laughed at the bitter irony. Yet the memories of camp life clung to her. She remembered the taste of coffee, the pages of Huckleberry Finn, the chalk dust on the sergeant's fingers. These details had unsettled her more deeply than any whip could. They had forced her to see the enemy as human, and now among ruins that memory was both salvation and torment. One afternoon she passed a crowd gathered around a truck. Aid workers in foreign uniforms handed out tins of food. Children scrambled, women stretched thin arms. She stood at the edge until a soldier pressed a can into her hands. The label read United States of America. Her throat tightened. Again the enemy fed her. She wanted to throw the can into the rubble to scream at the paradox, but her hands would not release it. She carried it home, and her relatives devoured it greedily. They praised the Americans' abundance while she remained silent, her heart torn. Weeks turned into months. She began writing again in her notebook, clumsy English sentences mixed with German fragments. She wrote about her brother, her mother, but most often about the camp, the smell of coffee, the silence of guards, the hesitant laughter during language lessons. Her relatives caught her once frowning at the foreign words. Why waste ink on their language, they asked. She lowered her eyes, unable to explain that writing connected her to something beyond the rubble. Guilt shadowed her every day. Each time she smelled food, cooking thin cabbage soup, burnt barley coffee, her mind betrayed her with memories of abundance behind barbed wire. She could not speak of it. To confess would sound like boasting even treason, and so she kept silent, carrying the paradox alone. Some women managed to rebuild. Others never recovered. A few remarkably chose to return to America years later, immigrating, marrying, building new lives. For them, the memory of captivity had transformed into a strange kind of belonging. But for many, including the Leipzig auxiliary, it remained a splinter lodged in the soul. She often returned to the ruins of her street notebook in hand. One evening she wrote a single sentence. In English, "I am still alive." The words looked fragile, but they felt stronger than any uniform she had ever worn. She closed the book, pressing it against her chest as if to protect it from the world's suspicion. Freedom had come, but it did not erase the war inside her. That war between memory and reality, guilt and gratitude, was the one she would fight for the rest of her life. The Americans had given her coffee books and mercy. Her own country had given her rubble and silence. And no amount of rebuilding could reconcile the two. In the end, what remained was not the fences, nor the guard towers, nor even the routine of captivity. What lingered most was the taste. For some it was bacon sizzling in a pan, for others apple pie cooling on a tray. But for the women who lived through those months in American camps, it was coffee, dark, steady, abundant. More than a drink, it became a symbol of contradiction. They had been told to expect cruelty and chains. Instead, they were met with warmth poured from a pot again and again. Mercy, they discovered, could be more dangerous than any whip. It disarmed not by breaking bones, but by breaking certainty. Every cup challenged the propaganda that had defined their world. Every refill whispered that the enemy was not the monster they had been told. In that simple ritual, humanity pierced the armor of ideology. Years later, many would speak of the paradox with a kind of haunted wonder. They could never forget the ruins of their homeland, nor the families who starved. Yet they also could not erase the memory of being treated with dignity when they expected only humiliation. Coffee had become a weapon, but not of steel or fire. It was a weapon of kindness, of patience, of soft power, and the final question lingered sharper than any blade. If mercy could exist even in the middle of war, what else had always been possible?